There is power behind every commercial relationship. Any experienced salesperson understands at a deep level that negotiations between two or more parties involve one party or the other enjoying more leverage than the other. It is the powerful who get the best deal. That's if they're competent negotiators, of course. We also see it all the time in our domestic purchases, everything from buying a bag of fruit from a market stall, in signing a mobile phone contract, right through to buying or renting the home we're living in. We almost instinctively know how far to press the other party when trying to strike a good deal, and feel the pressure when the other party has advantages over us. And anyone who closely follows politics and geopolitics as I do will appreciate the use and abuse of power by one party or the other in furthering their policy objectives. It is a fact that power is deeply embedded in how humans interact with each other, and corporate bodies behave in a very similar manner, with the consequences often being very significant indeed. In the portfolio matrix discussed in the earlier videos, it was evident that a customer with a large spending budget is more coveted by suppliers than would be a customer making a small one-off purchase. So procurement spend is a lever of power. In this video, I will explain how power can be diagnosed and then managed to create negotiating advantage for salespeople and their employers. By the end, viewers will be able to map the balance of power, what lies behind it, and begin to think about how they can adjust their engagement and communication practices and be more successful in winning and retaining business. Compelling research undertaken by the University of Birmingham confirmed the importance of power in commercial relationships, and in doing so designed a method where one party or another can systematically identify and then lever their power assets to gain superior results from their negotiations. But unfortunately, power has become a bit of a dirty word in commercial relationships. No one likes to be seen as a bully, nakedly exploiting another party in negotiations, and people shy away from expressing anything to do with power. Instead, we have become used to language like partnering, collaboration, mutuality, SRM, that's supplier relationship management, and other such terms, all of which somewhat mask what really goes on in business. Think for a moment about a publicly listed company. Its directors have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize returns over the medium to longer term. They may take a hit in the short term, but failure of the directors of the company to deliver dividends will result in shareholders withdrawing their investment and/or the directors being replaced. Now think of another listed company who the first company trades with. They also are on a mission to maximize financial returns for their shareholders. It's a logical certainty that both can't maximize their returns at the same time, however much they collaborate to make the pie larger. This inevitably creates a tension between the trading partners, as neither is able to secure their ideal outcome, and so compromises are made. The party who is able to make the fewest concessions is able to do so because it holds the balance of power in the relationship. Therefore, power is often deployed very subtly, with participants sometimes being unaware of how the communications within the relationship are being deliberately manipulated to create an advantageous outcome. To paraphrase Sir David Frost, negotiation is the art of letting someone else have your way. So the use of power to create leverage may feel less about dominating the other party, forcing the other party to your will, and more about the ability to set the agenda and lead discussions. After all, whoever has the most power decides what gets talked about. In our context of selling to procurement, suppliers should seek to understand what underpins power for both sides. Who has the balance of power today, and what can they do to change that balance in the future? So what brings power to a commercial relationship? Well, here's a sample list. The revenue impact of the customer on the supplier, as well as the supplier's share of the customer's procurement spend. The number of available suppliers versus the number of customers for a product or service. More suppliers for a given product brings a buyer greater choice and so confers negotiating leverage. To what extent relationship transactions are efficient? That's ways of working. The perceived brand value of one party in relation to the other. Superior or inferior technology, operational performance, innovation potential, etc. The availability to the buyer of substitute products or services or methods of acquisition, including the make versus buy option. To what extent switching costs are significant for one party or the other. Internal resistance to changing supplier amongst non-procurement stakeholders at the customer, or stakeholder inertia if you like. The competence of the supplier salespeople, and equally the competence of the customer's procurement people. And finally, and it doesn't always get a mention, is the ability of one party to know more about the situation than the other. More and better data and a superior understanding of where the leverage points are can make a real difference. The sales team can begin to map these and others using a simple spreadsheet, or if in a workshop, a flip chart. Listing the power assets of both parties, they can assign weightings or a numerical scoring mechanism and begin to, firstly and very importantly, remind the team that they have power assets they may have overlooked, taken for granted, or assumed they had little value in the power equation. But then also listing and weighting the power assets to help the sales team to think more deeply about how to communicate and engage with the customer in a way that subtly reminds the professional buyer that the supplier also has points of leverage and should therefore be taken seriously. When the salesperson looks down a list of power assets, it is unusual to find a single asset that can't be improved in some way, even if that improvement is simply reminding the customer, for example, of a supplier's superior delivery performance. And I'm regularly surprised by the number of salespeople I train who tend to bundle up good news only at the time of a contract rebid, rather than routinely sharing data that reminds the customer of the supplier's merits. Every good news message the salesperson can deliver plants a seed in the customer's mind that changing supplier might create greater risk. I will address the challenge of communicating your power in the next video, but for now I will explain how professional buyers diagnose the balance of power and what it means for their approach to negotiations and relationship management. The Power Matrix was designed by Andrew Cox during the period when the University of Birmingham team were researching power in business-to-business relationships. The matrix has become a component in the category management processes in the more advanced procurement organizations. However, even if it is not formally used, experienced professionals do have some degree of understanding of the power balance. After all, power is inherent in all negotiations. Practitioners who analyze it more systematically simply have an advantage over those that don't. Although power analysis can be very deep and sophisticated, an advantage can still be gained by baselining where the balance of power in the relationship currently is, and then highlighting where the relationship can potentially transition to. Starting with the list of power assets, an aggregate score or even a subjective assessment is better than nothing would be used to place each party's power on the scale from little or no power to dominant power, low to high if you prefer. And it is essential that the salesperson team list the power assets on the customer side too. This analysis then indicates in which one of the 4 quadrants the relationship currently sits and the likely commercial outcome that represents. Where both parties in a relationship have few power assets, then the relationship is one of 2 independents with little or no dependency on the other. An example could be something as mundane as a woman purchasing a coffee on the way to work in the morning. She's not too fussed about where she buys her coffee. One day she'll buy it from a kiosk at the railway station and the next from a shop adjacent to her office. Neither do the kiosk or shop owners care too much about whether she buys her drink from them tomorrow or the next day, as someone who didn't show up today will be a replacement customer on one of those days. In other words, they can get along without each other very well. There is no power struggle going on at all. The opposite is where customer and supplier are interdependent. Both have strong power assets. Perhaps the customer is one of a very small number of potential customers procuring a unique offering from a sole supplier. Neither can operate as successfully, at least in the short term, outside of this important relationship. These types of relationships are not without their tensions. Power is contested. For the professional buyer, having such a supplier with a strong power assets makes it very difficult to dictate value for money improvements or even control the relationship. Although here the salesperson is likely to be rather more content with the relationship, as he can resist those inevitable savings requests from procurement. Where the customer has power assets of greater impact than does the supplier, then this relationship is said to be buyer dominant. Procurement can make repeated demands on the supplier to step up and deliver improvements in value for money. In this type of relationship, the salesperson doesn't sleep. He has to keep driving his company to improve productivity, reduce input and manufacturing costs, be more innovative, more responsive, or something else. Supplier margins in this quadrant will typically be low, and there is likely to be the constant threat of deselection. Conversely, a supplier with a strong brand, an innovative solution, a wide choice of customers, even sheer scale and many other power assets can, where the buying organization is relatively weak, easily resist procurement demands for value improvements. This is the supplier dominance box. Although the buyer will be frustrated, sometimes enough to make a determined change, there is usually little they can do, and so will be a price taker. The supplier margins can be extraordinary here. Some procurement people wryly describe this quadrant as the Microsoft or Apple box, usually because demanding big discounts is unlikely to yield a compliant response. The challenge for the salesperson and for the supplier's whole team is to navigate away from a disadvantageous position, say in buyer dominance, to a more favorable one in interdependence and ultimately into supplier dominance. Actually making that transition is far from easy and may take sustained effort over many years, requiring new innovations and an improving degree of supply market dominance, perhaps through acquisition of competitors in the same market space. The supplier is trying to reduce the choices the customer has, so becoming a monopoly provider is frequently an aspiration, even if it is in the longer term. In summary, the party to the relationship who enjoys the balance of power is going to have better financial returns. Secure more power and you make more money. Most buyers and salespeople aren't forensic enough in accurately diagnosing who has the balance of power and why. Therefore, there is advantage to be gained in doing your homework and understanding power better than your customer and your competitors. Once the supplier understands what is determining the power balance, then improvements can be planned, building up strengths and addressing weaknesses, and communication and engagement strategies can potentially be transformed. In the next video, we'll discuss what makes for powerful communications.